Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Before the colors are posted, we want to recognize the significance of the men who would have carried them during the American Civil War. The Tryon Palace 35th United States Colored Troops, the USCT, reenactors honor the legacy of the Black soldiers who fought for freedom and citizenship during the American Civil War. The original 35th USCT was organized in 1863, with many of its members having once been enslaved, and they served with distinction, fighting not just for the Union, but for the promise of freedom and equality. If you're able and willing to please stand, if you would do that now for the posting of the colors.
Halt. Right face. Post colors. Present arms. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Order arms. Left face. Forward march.
You may be seated. Good evening, everyone. My name is Crystal Regan, and I'm the Executive Director here at Tryon Palace, and I want to welcome you to tonight's Juneteenth special lecture. I want to take a moment to say that this lecture is especially important as we move towards the eve of our semi-quincentennial. We are about to celebrate America's 250th anniversary in 2026. And there's a lot of history and important information that goes along with that. I want you to look to Tryon Palace for your edutainment, education, and entertainment as we prepare to help you understand what took place, particularly in the East, because the East has something to say about what happened during the American Revolution. So look at our website, call us, talk with us, because we look forward to engaging you over the next several months as we celebrate our semi-quincentennial. So thank you for joining us. Now I would like to introduce Mr. Vincent Biggs, Tryon Palace's Community Engagement and Program Coordinator. He's doing an amazing job. He's been with us for about, how many months? 5 months. 5 months, and he is doing an amazing job. If you haven't met him, you will. He is going to be out and about in the community. We have a lot going on at Tryon Palace in terms of programming, particularly with our inclusive public art program. I want to make I want to make sure I recognize one of our commissioners, Ms. Monica Minus. Monica, if you just stand and wave your hand for a moment. You will see her and you will hear from her as we prepare to talk about the legacy of Eastern North Carolina's amazing artisans, craftsmen, and women who helped build New Bern. And there'll be a lot more programs and education coming along with that. So thank you, Monica, for being here tonight. I also want to take a moment and recognize all of the Tryon Palace commissioners and foundation members. If you're just a member of the foundation, wave your hand, or commission. Thank you for being here tonight. If you're not a member of the Tryon Palace Foundation, please consider joining the foundation and supporting us as we endeavor to do great things here in terms of our historic buildings and programs. So with that, Mr. Biggs, our community engagement and program coordinator, if you'd come forth to set us up for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Come on, a little more energy. Good evening. Good evening. It is always an honor to be able to host and to have events such as the African American Lecture Series. So I was given the task to introduce our guest lecturer this afternoon. And if you have not heard of Dr. Valerie Johnson, you will leave this place tonight with that lasting impact. You will know exactly who she is. So let me just give you a little information about our lecturer tonight. Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson is a scholar and activist. She currently works as co-director of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. She has experience connecting undergraduate and graduate students, especially at HBCUs, with community groups working on health equity and environmental justice issues. Dr. Johnson works locally, nationally, and internationally to preserve cultural and historic heritage through service on several statewide and nonprofit organizations, including the North Carolina African American Heritage Commissions, where she served as the chair, the North Carolina Historical Commission, the Preservation North Carolina, she's the past immediate chair, North Carolina Maritime History Council Advisory Board, and National Registry Advisory Committee, promoting public participation in science research as a board member for the Association for Advancing Participatory Sciences and through grants that are funded by NASA. And the National Science Foundation is a core aspect of Dr. Johnson's ongoing activist work. So I ask that you this evening, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a good old New Bern welcome. Welcome our guest lecturer, Dr. Valerie Johnson.
Whew. So that's an introduction to live up to. Thank you so much, Vincent. And I want to thank the Tryon Palace community for bringing me here, especially Crystal Regan. I also want to thank those of you in the audience who've come out tonight to hear a little bit of my reflections on what Juneteenth means. As Vincent was saying, there are many aspects to my own life that I will be sharing as I talk about my reflections on what Juneteenth means, but it's a reflection that is couched with our understanding of the American Revolution, because I think there are some important connections that need to be made, and I'd like to make them and share that perspective with y'all. I also am an anthropologist, so I approach this as a curiosity about what we do as humans, how we organize ourselves, and what we can uncover, excavate, if you will, from stories, from narratives. So that's the part that I really like. It's understanding what is the story that we have to tell. And there are so many, and I will be sharing a few of them with you. So let me get, can't be a former professor without having some papers and at least one book. So, and I can't forget that if I'm going to try to read this, I need my readers. You know, this getting older is very interesting. I tell you. Because first I forgot that I need to use them in order to really see. Now I can see that fine. And of course, they're at the very bottom of my very little purse. So that's another thing about turning into your mama. So, as we engage in events leading up to the 250th commemoration of the founding of the United States, big concepts like freedom, liberty, democracy, and citizenship are core to understanding our nation's history. Tonight, I'm reflecting on the way Black people in North Carolina participated in the American Revolution as patriots, framing their actions within the ideas of freedom, liberty, democracy, and citizenship. What did it mean to be a patriot as a free person of color, or Black, or mixed race in North Carolina? In what ways did members of Black communities in Eastern North Carolina support the efforts to fight against the British? And since this talk is part of the Juneteenth celebration here at Tryon Palace History Center, my plan is to connect this early patriotism in the Black community with why Juneteenth has such currency in Black communities today, and why knowing and understanding history matters. So I start with one of my favorite quotes from a person who I admire greatly, Pauli Murray. And if you're not familiar with her, Pauli Murray was an amazing educator. She was clergy. She had various aspects of her life in scholarship, in activism. She was in fact, the founding of the National Organization for Women was her idea, and people don't really know that. And Pauli Murray's family is from both Chapel Hill and Durham. Her grandfather on the Fitzgerald side was a bricklayer, and did incredible work. You can find his work all over the state, especially in the Piedmont. But as a scholar, I'm really drawn to her. And as a person who was in the midst of understanding her own gender identity. So there are different aspects of Pauli Murray that are amazing. And in North Carolina, at the Pauli Murray home, we have a national landmark site. And it's one of the few, first, that depicts the history of a woman, and second, especially a Black woman. So the quote that I like to read about, and you can read it along with me, it had taken me almost a lifetime to discover that true emancipation lies in the acceptance of the whole past, in deriving strength from all my roots, in facing up to the degradation as well as the dignity of my ancestors. This is something that we can all embrace. And it's in that vein that I'm going to give you these remarks tonight. As we talk about revolution, I have another quote to get us kind of contextualized. We must begin to understand that a revolution entails not only the willingness to lay our lives on the firing line and get killed. In some ways, this is an easy commitment to make. To die for the revolution is a one-shot deal. To live for the revolution means taking on the more difficult commitment of changing our day today life patterns. And I think about those patriots during the American Revolution, willing to live for the revolution. They weren't going to die. They were going to live. And I want you to keep that idea in mind as I talk about the black patriots, the free folk who came from this part of North Carolina to serve for freedom's sake. And so Frances Beale, I cannot be an educator without at least letting you know Frances Beale is alive today. She's 80 plus, living in Oakland, California, and this quote comes from one of the essays she wrote, Double Jeopardy, as you can see there, to be black and female, and this was during the 70s. So this was in a different context, but it's a quote that I think can live with us all. So I start with the beginnings of black indigenous community in the Piedmont. And it's just reflective of that interconnection between black and indigenous folks across this state. And in this case, this is a family who's still living on their land in Orange County. And so this is part of a mural that they have, a huge mural that's in their family cemetery. And this is the main descendant. Her name is Judge Beverly Scarlett, who is in Orange County, and she is showing us not just the cemetery there, but also other burial mounds that were part of the family legacy. And in telling the story of her ancestors, she's also telling the story of development in North Carolina. So I put this slide in, these two slides, to remind us about the connection between free blacks, black folk, and indigenous people, the people who were here prior to colonization. I'm also reminding us of that quest for freedom from enslaved folks. Even though my talk tonight is mostly focused on free blacks, I cannot talk about that without talking about also the enslaved. And so this is a stop on the Underground Railroad that's in Guilford County. It's at Guilford College, and these are reenactors who tell that story of that stop going deliberately into that campus community. So these are woods just adjacent, the part of Guilford College. And so they tell that story so that we understand these different places along the Underground Railroad. The other context that I was giving to you are two things from a website, I Remember Our History, and they talked about freedom seekers. And one of the things I just wanted to share in terms of talking about narratives and stories is how did they throw off the scent of those hounds? So you would send hounds off to try to get back your property. And these two paintings are from Englishmen who thought about the story of enslaved Africans escaping. The first one is called The Hunted Slaves, and the second one is in the Dismal Swamp. And many of you who were here on this side are familiar with the Dismal Swamp. Not everybody who I talk to really has an idea about its actual location in North Carolina and Virginia, and that it is an incredible place just to be. And I think about the way in which folks really created these maroon colonies. Maroon colonies were escaped enslaved persons who set up, with the help of the indigenous folks of the area, these encampments, these towns, these places of refuge in the Dismal Swamp. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm just imagining as hot as it was today, to be in the swamp with mosquitoes. It's not something easy to conceptualized in our modern times, but gives me immense respect for that thirst to be free. And I did tell you that they had different ways of throwing off the trail. Well, one of the things that North Carolina is known for is naval stores. And that is the kinds of materials that come out of our pine trees. Turpentine is one, and what they use to build ships. So this was a rich area in creating tar and turpentine. And so enslaved persons would put turpentine on the bottoms of their soles in order to throw off the scent of the hounds who would be trained to chase them. In Texas, they used a paste made from charred bullfrogs. Folk used what they could find. Other things that they used to throw off the scent would be red pepper, wild onions, or even mud from graves to cover the scent. So, the promise of freedom. In this next few sections, I'm talking about promises, because freedom is something that is sought on a daily basis. If we really want to think about it, it's not something that's just given. It's something that we work for, work towards, and we have to keep it front of mind. Sometimes we don't. We just take for granted that we're able to do things in whatever way that we want to. But the promise of freedom that I'm talking about is the promise that was given to folks upon emancipation that we're still working out. So, going back, I love the swamp, right? But I also love rivers. And this is the Lumbee River. Now, deliberately, this is not misspelled. Most folk know it as the Lumber River. But for the Lumbee, it is the Lumbee River. It has always been. And that cypress tree is 250 years old. And you can see the scale of that enormous tree. And there were many more along the way, but this is one of the oldest. And I thought, this was a sapling at the time of the American Revolution. So what was that river like? How was it configured during that time? And that cypress tree gives us a clue, a hint of what it was like. So I'm use that to take us into that time. So the American Revolution was fought in part against the tyranny of a king. Black men fought both for and against Britain in the War of American Independence. This is one of my favorite stories. And I am certain that there are people in this audience who are descendants of the people I'm getting ready to talk about. Getting chills thinking about it, Mr. George. The Forgotten 14 from Harlow. Anyone here from Harlow, Havelock, New Bern? Some of you are raising your hands. Parents, relatives, descendants, ancestors. I raise this because during the American Revolution, 14 free black men from Harlow, North Carolina, fought for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. I just learned about them fairly recently, and I say recent, in the last 4 to 5 years. These men left their families, left them in conditions that they needed to be at home. but they had a pressing need to be able to fight for the rights that they knew that they had as free people in North Carolina. But as I learned from a video that Mr. George was in, that this Harlow community originally came from Tidewater, Virginia, and they came to North Carolina seeking a better and freer way of life because of the laws in Virginia against black folks, especially free blacks, were getting constricted and narrower. That means that their freedom was at question. So can you imagine being born free and then having to always look over your shoulder, not knowing when the law was going to change that would enslave you because you have black skin or you have black ancestry? So they left Tidewater, they left Virginia, and came south, came into North Carolina, and set up that community in Harlow. These men would have, in serving, would have been dressed similar to this. So this would be a reenactment. And that's why I was so excited for our 35th to be here tonight, because they show us how important it is to remember these stories and the living embodiment of these stories you can see in these reenactors. They are not just actors making up something. This is real history from descendants who've researched their own family. And we can now go back to these 14 men. And I am going to take the liberty of reading out their names because I think they need to be spoken in the space as patriots, as those who are fighting for freedom and liberty with their white neighbors, that they endured the hardships of being in that Revolutionary War. And it turned out that only about 487 or so free blacks served on the Patriot side because the British had promised enslaved persons that they would get their freedom if they fought for the British. That didn't work out too well. And we are so glad. So in recognizing the service, we have Martin Black, Isaac Carter, John Carter, Joshua Carter, William Dove, John Gregory, Absalom Martin, Simeon Moore, George Perkins, Isaac Perkins, Aaron Spellman Spellmore, depending on the record that you find, but it's the same person, Asa Spellman Spellmore, Hezekiah Stringer, and Mingo Stringer. Some of you may be related to these persons who fought. So I challenge you to look into your history, if you're from this area especially, because of that connection. They organized themselves, and when these black soldiers went north with the Continental Army and south to Charleston, for example, engaging in battles all across the colonies. We have a story from Isaac Carter that he was captured by the British in Charleston, escaped, and walked back to Harlow, Charleston, South Carolina. That kind of tells you the unpreparedness in many ways of that British Army, dealing with folks who were committed to the place of home, the place of birth. And that is hard to overcome in many ways, because they are committed to making themselves free. And in notice of this, in this 2014, there was a lot of work around getting this to happen on September 3rd of 2016, where the chapter was created, the Patriot Isaac Carter chapter for the Sons of the Revolution, American Revolution. Now, this is the only predominantly black chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution that's currently organized. And I just wanted you all to see their pledges, that this chapter exists, that they are active in reenacting that kind of service, and that these are folks in North Carolina. And oftentimes our state gets overlooked a little bit. We get emphasis on Georgia and South Carolina and then the northern states in terms of the American Revolution, except when you talk briefly about the regulators and what was going on in this part. But to connect it to African American communities is amazing and important. And part of the reason why I wanted to bring this to you, because it connects back to the continuing service, military service, that brings us to folks who then fight in the Civil War. They were not folks who were just coming new to the idea of serving in military. It had been a long legacy. And even before the American Revolution, those families, those soldiers that left, they had a history of fighting in other battles and wars that the colonists had engaged in previous to the American Revolution. So it is a history of military service that doesn't start and stop just with these wars, but it's a continuation up until today. So the promise of liberty. And I give this to you because if you think of freedom, freedom is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance. So freedom, the power or right to act. Liberty is a state, the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life. So the restrictions that were imposed during the American Revolutionary times continue in various other ways for black communities as we're going forward into the time of the Civil War. And here's where Juneteenth is such an important aspect of that quest, that continuing quest for liberty and freedom. So this is the actual General Orders number 3 that came down, that informed the people of Texas 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863, goes into effect. So 2 years later, they find out, well, just over 2, almost 2.5, that they find out that they are indeed free. But just being told that you're free doesn't mean that you're really free. So what comes after this is some of the important pieces, and the commemoration of Juneteenth is about what comes after. So this happens, this event occurs, and you can see kind of the rules that were given. Even though they had equality of rights, there were some strictures that were made. And I like to take a minute here and quote from Dr. Martin Luther King in Why We Can't Wait. And he writes about, in 1963, so this is 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, where he says, "The milestone of the centennial of emancipation gave the Negro a reason to act, a reason so simple and obvious that he almost had to step back to see it. Simple logic made it painfully clear that if this centennial were to be meaningful, it must be observed not as a celebration, but rather as a commemoration of the one moment in the country's history when a bold, brave start had been made, and a rededication to the obvious fact that urgent business was at hand. The resumption of that noble journey toward the goals reflected in the preamble to the Constitution itself, the Bill of Rights, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the 19th. So here is that commemoration. This is in Austin, and it's called Emancipation Day. And you see how folks were dressed up to commemorate. And I loved how folk understood themselves so that they appeared in this way. And what they were commemorating, as I said, were those general orders. And Major General Gordon Granger was the commanding officer, the District of Texas. He delivered these Galveston General Orders number 3. But they were also pledged to make sure the orders were carried out, because that's the other part of the story. It's not, which is why it's commemoration, not celebration, because they had to fight to keep themselves free. Emancipation Day is another term that's used to talk about this time of emancipation. And Emancipation Day is usually talked about in terms of Washington, D.C. So the D.C. compensated Emancipation Act of 1862 ended slavery just in Washington, D.C. for about 3,100 individuals. They were so the persons who owned them were reimbursed, and the newly freed women and men were given money to immigrate. And that's a whole nother story about immigration efforts to say, okay, y'all have the money to leave and go and be somewhere else, but maybe not here. But what also, I know you know that building, but before we get to that building, what comes out of this liberation, this moment of being free within society, are institutions like St. Joseph's Episcopal Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina. That's 1873. Or the historically black colleges that start with Shaw University, 1865. It's also your King Solomon Lodge here, where Freemasons created the first African-American Masonic Lodge. But this idea that we can now realize ourselves in the way that we want to be, the communities that we want to build, the institutions that we need to have to be citizens, to be a part of this. So, the promise of democracy. This woman, Frances Thompson, her testimony helped ratify the 14th Amendment. This is in Memphis, Tennessee. They had race riots as people were as blacks were asserting their freedom. And she testified about what happened to her when marauders came into her house. White marauders came in and sexually assaulted her, her roommate, also stole from her, all these things to suppress her, to oppress her. And she's testifying to Congress because in 1866, the first Civil Rights Act becomes realized. 1866. So we're not talking something modern. This is right after the ending of the Civil War. This is the progress that was being made then, and the process of creating a democracy, of them bringing these folks who had been enslaved into the citizenship, into a democratic state. And so she's testifying, and based on her testimony, in part, Tennessee becomes a state that ends up ratifying the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Needed that last state. And this is, again, a freedmen's schoolhouse, the drawing of what happened during that riot. And this freedmen's schoolhouse would be a part of that educational system free blacks were building for themselves with the help of various philanthropic organizations. So, the promise of citizenship. So part of the promise of citizenship is being able to vote. So this, again, 50 years post-emancipation, women are still seeking full citizenship, black women, brown women, and the right to vote. So this was the crisis, which was a publication from the NAACP that then talks about various aspects of black life, but also has essays. And so the essay on the right is Votes for Women. So black folk were very much involved in the suffragette movement. As we think about things, so this is the state of Georgia, and in the middle of the state toward the west, you can see Americus. I think you can see it. If you see Atlanta where the star is and just continue to go south, I don't know if this, you see Americus. Near Plains, and just north of Albany. Okay, so you got the picture. These young women, they were 13 to 15 years old during the civil rights struggle in the 60s, protested in Americus against Jim Crow. And they were arrested and put in a stockade south, somewhere around Americus. Their parents were not told where they were. For a month, no one knew where exactly they were. There were rumors, but they didn't know the exact location because this was an old stockade. The way they found out was, again, with a white northerner who was part of SNCC, as a young man, came, started asking questions, and he was able to do so because he was being white and naive, supposedly, and found out where they were, and he takes the photograph. And it's a part of, his last name was Leesburg, and it's a part of a whole collection. And he takes a picture of these young women and then puts it out into the newspapers in the North. And that's how the parents found out where their children were, and then petitioned and fought to get them released. They knew they were gone, they just didn't know where. So imagine that. And imagine these children saying, we're going to strike, we're going to protest because we have the right to be wherever we can pay to be. So, in these last few minutes, I'm going to talk about the hope of revolution. Why am I showing Fred Wesley and the Ocean City Jazz Fest? Because part of the hope of revolution is that we might not die for it, but to live for it means to do what? It means in part the music that we create, the things that we create within our communities provides us with this idea of revolution. Revolution is the reimagining of what can be, and then putting into action the means to get there. It doesn't have to be violent overthrow. It starts with the imagination. What are you imagining our world could be? And that can be a revolutionary act. So while the American Revolution centers around a fight against the tyranny of kings, our fight today is against the tyranny of terror. how we can be oppressed by terror, to stay in our little places and to be quiet and not to imagine a better world for all of us. So I bring in Fred Wesley and Topsail Island, North Topsail Island, a black community. So every year they celebrate from July 5th, July 4th, for a few days, they celebrate that music, that tradition that we have. And it's an amazing gathering. And it's at the beach. And it reminds us of community building and what folks fought for back in 1776. And so, I'm going to leave you with two things. From Howard Zinn, who was an extraordinary historian, he said, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness." Oppressive language is a violence, and it does more than represent the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge itself. So, what language of revolution do we give to ourselves? Do we have? So I'm going to leave you with, I can't sing it, but I will read it as the poem it was originally started, and it's only the first verse, and it's very familiar to many, many of us. Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. James Weldon Johnson, 1900. First performed in public by 500 school children in a segregated school, Stanton, in Jacksonville, Florida. Thank you. I do have references.
Wouldn't be an educator without references, right?
I can't help myself.
One more time, can we clap our hands and applaud Dr. Johnson? Okay. I don't know if they can hear me. All right. So at this time, what we're going to do is we're going to have just a little Q&A. If there's any questions that you all may have for Dr. Johnson, we definitely didn't want to bring her all this way and not give you the opportunity to ask questions. Please keep in mind that any questions that we cannot answer in this setting tonight, immediately following, we're going to have a reception. So you'll have an opportunity to ask questions in a little more informal setting, okay? So any questions? And just give me time to get to you with the mic because we want to make sure everyone hears your question. Okay, all right?
Hi. I really enjoyed this evening, and I feel really inspired to ask questions. My question is, that you have knowledge in regards to archaeology. Any knowledge in your journey of research? Have you discovered anything about Black people or Negroes in ancient antiquity?
So I'm a cultural anthropologist, which means I don't do the digging, and the exciting part, well, actually archaeology is a very patient, slow process. But I do know of and have learned a little bit from my colleagues who are actually archaeologists. And one of the persons I look to is Ivan van Sertima, who documents African presence in what we consider Central America, dating back to Mayan, pre-Mayan experiences. And so there's these Olmec heads, they're these huge, giant stone heads, and he has made the case that they were reflecting the Africans who came on the voyage across the Atlantic, following the currents into Central America. So that's one example of what my colleagues have found who are actual archaeologists. We also have, you say antiquity, I'm not all the way back there, but in more recent times, and what's going on at Eastern Carolina University is they have a maritime history program. And there they have found the connection to enslavement on slave ships, so, and on pirate ships. So if you know anything or think about pirates and what piracy was all about, one person's pirate is another person's privateer. So they would be hired by different nations to fight against each other and to plunder and pillage and get whatever you could. Well, one of those is the Queen Anne's Revenge. But before it was Queen Anne's Revenge, which is the ship that was known as Blackbeard's ship, it was a slaver called La Concorde. And so understanding that history and seeing the gold dust, you can actually, even though it's at the bottom of the ocean, if you sift through the sand, you can find, that's why I say takes a lot of patience. You can find little bits of gold dust or little weights and waist beads that Africans would have had on them that document the presence of Africans on this ship.
The second part of my question is in regards to cultural genocide. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts. It is, again, an aspect of humanness that is troubling and problematic, and it's not just a recent phenomenon. It is something that cuts across human history, this engagement in genocidal acts against other folks identified as other, as something different than who you are. And so the idea is that they don't need to exist because they are against whatever it is I'm standing for. So my idea is about cultural genocide. So there's the physical part, but then there's also the ways in which you can attempt to erase cultural history. But it resurfaces. That's part of my whole mission, is to prevent the cultural genocide by lifting up the narratives of folks who are somewhat hidden so that it's not going to be the erasure. Does that get to your question a little bit?
Okay. Thank you so much. Another question. Okay, I'm going to come around. Dr. Johnson, you got everybody thinking tonight. Everybody has questions. All right, what? I saw, okay. Where? Okay.
Hi, and thank you. My question was about when you were talking about the promise of freedom and the the Harlow 14 that went and fought for the Union soldiers, but were there also other people, enslaved or freedmen, or specifically enslaved people that were promised freedom if they came and fought for the Union? And were they granted that freedom? Was there a struggle there? What were the accommodations, or what was the carrot that they used to try and, did that happen as far as enslaved people being either sent or recruited or volunteering to fight for either the Confederacy or the Union, and did they get what they were promised?
Yes and no. It's the short answer. So there were different mechanisms that were used to entice folk, but there are also more oppressive measures where enslaved enslaved men and boys, have to always remember that there were 13, 14-year-olds that were sent, would be sent in the place of their masters, or they would be paid to go and to fight. And the British promised a whole lot and didn't deliver. Well, they lost one. But I would say that wasn't a real promise, because both sides were talking in terms of freedom and enslaved. But when you look at our Constitution, there isn't that, especially in that Declaration of Independence, it's silent about slavery. It was in Thomas Jefferson's original writings and what he proposed to the Congress, and the Southern states said, "Oh no," and they removed it. But it is also kind of interesting that Thomas Jefferson was writing so harshly about English or British involvement in the slave trade as a slave owner himself. Yeah. So that's why I say it was complicated. It was more, what was the utilitarian way in which we could make this happen? So that's why what the Harlow Patriots did, as well as other free black men, this is just one community, what they did was kind of amazing. And they were promised pensions. And this is how we found out, and this is part of the story, this is how we found out about the Harlow Patriots. Doing the research, not just what families knew about them, but also looking at the pension records. And what was going on is that these men would go to court to petition for for the pension that they were promised as Revolutionary War soldiers. And their wives would go and petition to say, where's our payment for that was promised? And so then we learn that story, which is kind of the beauty of history, is being able, this is why I document. Y'all write down stuff. And when you do pictures, please let us know who they are and when. I found more pictures that I can't, I said, oh, these are great pictures. Can't show them because I don't know who they are, when it was, or anything. So just make those notes, all y'all, on your photos.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. We are all out of time. I'm so sorry.
Oh, we are
I know
out of time?
we had,
Okay.
but we have a reception, and we do want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to enjoy the reception. And again, it's another, just an informal setting to be able to talk to Dr. Johnson, ask any questions that you may have. She'll be hanging out with us for a bit this evening. So we do, again, want to say thank you so much for coming out. One more time, we give a hand applause for Dr. Johnson.
And thank you all.
And also want to applaud Tryon Palace Executive Director, Ms. Crystal Regan, who always finds ways and opportunities to educate the New Bern community.
Yes.
So thank you so much. So at this time, we'll go ahead and transition from this room right out into our Maddox reception hall to enjoy some heavy hors d'oeuvres. Thank you again for coming.
Ooh.